as well as a facilitator and the faculty advisor to the civil rights team at Kennebunk High School, and has been active in the community as well as in the Episcopal Church in Maine in holding conversations on the topic of race. So I thank you so much for being with us tonight, Greg. It is a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you.
I'd like to open us with a prayer that is based on Ephesians. It was offered today by a friend, and it comes from the Iona community, and I just think it's really appropriate for where we are right now. So let us pray. Mm-hmm. There is no pain in our hearts or in our planet that you do not know, for you have touched the lowest places on earth. Teach us to grieve with you, O Christ, the loss of all the beauty that is dying. There is no place in the heavens that you cannot be touched by your resurrection presence, for you fill all things. Give us strength in your victory over death, to grow in your way of love, which does not despair, but keeps sowing seeds of hope and making signs of wholeness. Under Christ's control, all the different parts of the body fit together, and the whole body is held together by every joint with which it is provided. Teach us to know our interconnectedness in all things. Teach us to grow with each other and all living creatures through love. Amen. Greg, it is all yours, my friend.
Thank you very much. It's incredible to be given this opportunity, and I appreciate all of you coming today and giving me a chance to speak with you. It's a humbling experience to be asked to speak about something like this, and it is a difficult experience to be asked to speak on something like this. I think I have to start here by saying this is wonderful. This is fantastic and an important step that you are coming together and asking questions and seeking answers and inviting others into your midst to share their understandings and their experience. I beg you not to let it culminate in me. As a white man who experiences this country and this world through that lens, the best I can do is what you're doing right now, which is to try to learn as much as I can and share what I have learned when asked to do so. I cannot speak from personal experience, and I am not going to attempt to speak in any voice other than my own. So I encourage you, as you look ahead in your own journeys towards understanding and hopefully action, to seek out voices that can speak to what I can't. I don't want to claim to be any kind of authority on this, but I have been offered the challenge to learn about this material, and was glad to take up that challenge, and have been put in a position where I have the opportunity not only to teach my regular history students on topics related to race and bias issues in this country, but have developed a elective course at my school that specifically deals with these, which has allowed me to dive a bit deeper in. And while I love the school and the community that I work with, shortly after my arrival at this school 3 years ago, we were slammed by a incident of racism that made the national news. And so literally months after me becoming the point person for race issues at my school, I found out why nobody at my school had wanted to do it before I showed up. So in a way, I've been thrust into this, and it's been a blessing. I found myself very fulfilled to be able to provide answers as the questions become louder and louder in society. It's been nice to get started on this before some of the more recent events made everything even more urgent. But if anything, it's only encouraged me to realize that this is a long, long road that is going to continue past all of our deaths. And I think we have to recognize that the problems we're going to talk about today started long before any of us were born and will continue after we're gone. And understanding and taking action to make a change is vital, but we cannot enter this discussion believing that we can solve the problem. We can only enter this discussion believing that we can be part of a solution that is much greater than us. Because, and this I believe is important and where I really want to start, the problem is greater than any one of us. The problem is greater than any one poor decision that any single actor has made on their own journeys. The problem is bigger than Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, the problem is baked into the very fabric, the very recipe for America. It's beyond important to begin this conversation at the beginning. And for America, the beginning of problems with race comes to the indigenous people that were encountered as soon as white Europeans arrived in North America, frankly, in the Americas. But if you look at the initial encounters between the Spanish and their goal to derive wealth from the local populations, and then the English, who looked not simply to derive wealth, but also to establish a new and better society, the indigenous population was a problem. For the English who are arriving in New England, where we all are now, there was an additional layer to this. When many of our forefathers arrived on the shores of New England, they found death and destruction. Before we even engaged in forms of intentional genocide and ethnic cleansing, which have to be part of our vocabulary, the microbes that preceded us, the diseases that preceded us, had already ravaged the coastal populations of New England and had already made their way into the interior. So that often, for example, in Maine, where I'm living, when the first white settlers set foot on the ground, they found primarily empty villages. What this set up was a twisted dynamic. In Virginia, when the English had arrived, they thought that they could take on the Spanish tradition of abusing the local population, essentially enslaving the local population and forcing them to produce wealth for their settlers. That's actually why the early Virginia settlements had so much difficulty succeeding, because they didn't plan to provide for themselves. They planned to enslave the local population. When the when the what would become New Englanders arrived in New England, that idea had already largely failed in Virginia. But there were still remnants of indigenous populations here. And the conflict of we are a good Christian society built to represent the best of God's intentions on earth. And yet, as we step onto shore, we are confronted with people who've been ravaged by disease. And the easiest way for us to succeed is not to treat them as equals. Our initial footing in this country was based on trying to explain why those people arriving from Europe were worth more time, more attention, more investment, more space, whatever it might be, than the people who were already here and who largely were either in need of help or not interested in our presence. It set up a dynamic. We had to seek excuse for treating each other the way we wanted to treat each other. And the idea of race fit. The idea of race had been developed a century, almost 2 centuries at this point earlier, in order to justify the enslavement of Africans by the Portuguese. This concept that other people were less human, often defined by their Christianity, but when Christianity was hard to determine, skin color became an easier determinant. Simply saying the darker, the more foreign became easier than trying to quiz somebody on whether or not they'd been baptized. So we started to adopt these notions that as baptized Christians and as Europeans, we had certain rights to the people and to their property that were simply granted by God. This had nothing to do with why we had arrived here. It had everything to do with justifying the way we acted once we'd arrived. And for better or worse, the native population was no longer robust enough to essentially be enslaved. Now, let me be clear. Indigenous persons in North America, in the English colonies, absolutely, positively were enslaved. And they were enslaved for hundreds of years. We have a tendency to talk about the enslavement of natives as if we did that until we found a better option. That is wildly inaccurate. The problem with enslaving natives was twofold. Number one, there weren't that many. There just weren't. They had mostly been killed out by disease, and there were conflicts where there were. The second problem with enslaving natives was that essentially escape was easier. They had communities. They had familiarity with the land. If they fled, they had the ability to rejoin their communities and succeed. So we began looking for a population that was more enslavable. The Portuguese had already been doing it in Africa. There was already a pipeline that was readily available. So we joined in, and it was profitable, and it was beneficial. And you know what? We'd already worked out the theology to say that it was acceptable, because as long as we claimed that we were not enslaving Christians, it was all right. And for those who were uncomfortable with bringing non-Christians into the country, we could variously argue that we were improving the lives of these non-Christians by exposing them to Christianity. And you can see that over time, we begin to argue that, as a matter of fact, we should baptize our slaves to prove that we are making their lives better. And I bring this up, this extraordinarily long and complex history of excuses, to make the point simply that we wanted something and we got it. We wanted free labor and we got it. When religion helped us justify that, we used it. When race theory helped us justify that, we used it. But at the end of the day, all of the calculus was economic, and it was power-based. When we think about enslavement in the early colonies, as we step away from the question of natives and start talking about Africans, Black people in this country, another interesting dynamic develops. This is going to be a much more robust system in the South, where the farms are larger and require more manual labor than necessarily the land could sustain in the North. Not that it was easy farming in the North, but you couldn't pull the same level of profitability out of each acre to support slaves at the same level. We still had plenty of slaves up here, but you don't see the large concentrations like you did in the South. So turning the story back to Virginia, we see Black slaves coming in, and there's immediately a problem because we have white people in indentured servitude, and it's pretty hard to see what's the difference between an indentured white person or even an enslaved Irishman or woman and an enslaved Black person. So the House of Burgesses, the ruling government in Virginia, struck upon a rather clever solution. And to simplify history slightly for the interest of time, they ruled that that slavery would be racial. See, the problem, of course, was what happens when the poor white people who are being mistreated turn to the poor Black people who are being mistreated and suddenly realize that they see eye to eye. And the Black people share the problems of the white people, and the problem is the rich people. Well, that was not going to fly, because as soon as the poor Blacks and the poor whites formed an alliance, revolutions would start. And as a matter of fact, there were inklings, there were itches, there were little moments of possible revolution, of rebellion. And so they slammed down on that hard, and they created a system which said white equals free, Black equals slave. And more importantly, the lowest, most worthless, most penniless white person is worth more than the best of the Blacks. That way they could say to the poor whites, yeah, you're poor. I know that must suck, but at least you're white. At least you've got that going for you. Go team white. And that was able to create and contain white people as a separate unit to head off that class struggle that was already kicking off in the 1500s. We were able to head that whole thing off by creating a race structure and not a class structure. Of course, ignoring the fact we've got a class structure. But by adding race in as another level, as another separator, creating functionally caste, where people are defined by their birth and not their work ethic, where people are lumped into predicted categories that they will maintain and that they cannot change in this lifetime. We created a society where power could be protected, where the rich did not have to fear popular revolution from the poor because they were allied with the poor based on race. This basic model worked so well in Virginia that it was adopted either de facto or de jure across the country. And I want to say that again. Everywhere across the United States, this practice was adopted and it was maintained. What differentiated the system in the South was that they put the laws to it in such an obvious way that it was the first thing you noticed, and it was in essence a point of pride. In the North, where labor conditions were different, where the press of humanity against one another was different, that kind of blatant segregation didn't work as well. But it was still there. And we still were able to maintain that caste structure, that differentiation between the poorest white man is better than the best black man across the country. And that's the structure on which we built the United States, North and South. The tensions on other topics flare up over time. But as long as we were always able to turn back to one another and say, hey, go team white men, we were able to move forward. And we were able to actually achieve quite impressive heights because we had found a common ground and we had identified a large and growing population in our country that could be used as the subjugated class, that could be used to steal their labor, to steal their innovation, to steal their credit, generation after generation after generation. We accomplished incredible things. We reinvented the way transfers of power take place in society. We introduced the first functioning democratic republic that has been able to last for centuries. We embraced the Industrial Revolution at levels that were hard to imagine in other countries because other countries had to worry about what happens when the bottom rises up. We solved that problem by creating an artificial structure of race that allowed us to ally on something other. So I looked at the questions that a number of you submitted, and I thank you. And I hope that when we get into question and answer, I can try to answer some of those more directly. But I think the point that I want to make, that I want to base in this deep history, is that this is not a new problem. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 changed nothing. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 changed nothing. The attack on the Capitol last Wednesday changed nothing. These are patterns of protecting power that not only have existed for centuries, but have allowed America to become the country that it is. So when people fight back and say, we stand for American values, they mean it. And when we say we believe that America can be stronger when all people are empowered, we're actually inventing a whole new America. Now, personally, I believe that that whole new America could be a better one, but we have to recognize that the tradition in this country is to protect the status quo, and the status quo is white power. We see when we look closer at it, especially when we look, say, 1860 to present, what we see is the growing influence of the idea that all people have something to contribute. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to redefine our definition of all people. And it turns into a push and pull. As we push the envelope of what all people means, a backlash comes. So that when slavery is officially ended, we see a backlash in Reconstruction that was nastier than anything we'd seen in the antebellum period. When we see people begin to push that, hey, slavery's over, let's see Black people welcomed into neighborhoods, welcomed into professions, we see the rise of a terrorist war that lasted a century from 1865 into the 1960s and arguably well beyond, of lynching and extrajudicial murder to keep the system the way that it was. When we looked at the 60s, we saw a push to end the laws of segregation. So we saw a push back to create more subtle laws, to create more subtle cultural patterns, which said that, sure, Black people are actually going to less integrated schools in 2020 than they were in 1970, but it's not because the law says so. It's because we've based schooling, public schooling, on local funding. And who's got a problem with local funding? Shouldn't your tax base pay for the schools that they can afford? But that is a policy to prevent integration. When I was living in San Antonio, Texas, the school district that surrounded me, I taught at a private school at that point, but the school district that surrounded me was one of the fastest growing school districts in the country, population-wise. They'd outgrown their high school. Their high school was tired, it was old, it was decrepit. So they had a vote. Let's build a new high school. And the obvious solution was build a new high school, keep the old one running, split it in half. So they redistricted. They redrew the lines. And I'm sure you can guess where this is going. When they drew the lines, they drew around the neighborhoods that were poor, Hispanic, and Black. And I'm sure you can guess which high school they got. The new, gorgeous, state-of-the-art high school that they built went to the white kids. In an instant, an integrated high school became two highly segregated high schools. And Brown versus Board of Education has nothing to say on it. As we move forward, we have to understand that old quote of the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice is very hopeful. But if we think it's the only thing running that course, if we think that it is only one pressure on the moral arc of the universe to bend in one direction and all we have to do is be patient, we're missing the fact that the other side is pushing back. And they're strong because the forces of the status quo have a lot of advantages and have spent centuries protecting those advantages. So could the moral arc of the universe point towards justice? Sure. But it only comes when we recognize the power structures that allow the injustice to continue and begin to remove them. It's not about racists. It's about the power that allows people to benefit from racism. As soon as politicians can't get elected through racist policies, the policies will change. As soon as individuals are not given the option to choose racism, they won't. We can force people to make better decisions if we recognize the better decisions that are available to society. But it has to be an active choice to upend existing power structures. And the very phrasing of that means the power structure is not on our side in that choice. I think I've babbled past my time. Sorry about that. I want to turn it over and see where people would like to take this, if I may. Does anybody have questions or pushback? Anything?
Were there any of the specific questions that were sent in ahead of time that perhaps you want to spend a little more time with?
I would love to. Unfortunately, in order to get my computer to run anywhere close to on time, I can't open the tab I put them all in.
Okay.
So if anybody would be willing to help out, sorry.
Well, I'm going to that. If somebody wants to ask a question, please unmute yourself and feel free.
Greg, Scott Conrad here. Thanks so much for that perspective. It is illuminating. It's discouraging that this inertia is such a powerful force. But I don't know, as a guy who's been on this planet for 66 years now, I look back over the arc of my lifetime, and at least, in my little milieu, it does feel as though there was progress. I mean, is the problem solved after hundreds of years? No, but it felt like it was inching in the right way. And I mean, if you look in the workplace, and look at the people who are employed, I mean, there are opportunities for minorities that did not exist before. I think if you talk to them, they would probably say, well, there still is a ceiling, but it's an incremental slog. I'm curious, in the last 10, 15 years, I mean, you mentioned the Obama inauguration, and I'm a guy that sent in a question asking you to comment from then to present. It felt to me like there was progress, but it also feels to me like in the last 4 years, and now it's going to sound pointed, like it's a trick question, but it feels to me like we've rewound the clock and we've gone backward and lost some ground. And so I guess the question is, what role do you see that the media and public education and institutionalized, organized religion have in changing any of this, reversing and getting us back on the road to progress rather than retrograde,
No, I understand. Thank you for that. I please don't get me wrong. I don't want to give the impression that all is negative. We've achieved nothing. Progress has been made, and I believe that progress continues to be made. There are victories to celebrate. Georgia just elected their first Black senator. There is progress to celebrate. However, I think what has really led us down some dark paths in the last couple decades is the false hope that this is hearts and minds, right? That if we just can convince people to be kind, to love one another, that all solutions will follow from that. That if we can just, embrace Jesus's teaching that, love the Lord thy God and love your neighbor as yourself, all's good. Don't get me wrong, that's great. Love, kindness, these have important roles to play, but I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works. And I'll use an example. We think about something like affirmative action. I, as a white middle-class man, might get upset if my son is denied a place at a university that I believe he deserved to get into. And I could oppose the policy of affirmative action out of kindness and love, because I love my son and I want the best for him. And if somebody's going to deny him the best, well, shoot, I'm going to fight for that. Nothing in what I just said is unkind or unloving or really even unfair. But it perpetuates the racist power imbalance. So I can perpetuate racism through love and through kindness. So that can't be the full solution to get out of it. You asked about the role of media, the role of the church, the role of education. And I think that for all of those, the answer is largely the same, that we need to expose the power structures that allow racism to profit and help people choose a better path. Schools, in the classroom, I can teach students about recognizing racist patterns, sexist patterns, because really all of these forms of power bias manifest remarkably similarly. And as long as we can start learning how to recognize them and start developing techniques to change the policies when we recognize them, we can force people who don't want to be kind to do the right thing. The church has the exact same role. It's wonderful to teach love and to teach brotherhood, but the church has to look at what power structures does it stand for. We have to ask, what role is something like prosperity gospel playing in not only maintaining but expanding the power structure? What role does the Episcopal Church have to play to be a force for good and not just a force for kindness and love? Because unfortunately, the two are not one and the same.
Absolutely.
And at its best, the media is me with a louder microphone, right? I can teach one classroom at a time. The media can teach thousands, millions of viewers at a time. If we can find ways to incentivize that, what we value, and not just the profit motive, or better yet, create a profit motive around the right decisions, we can see real change.
Yeah, the issue in your curriculum in school, which sounds terrific, is that it's an elective.
Absolutely.
It's an elective. So the people that come there are by nature going to be predisposed to want to learn about this and do something about it. What about the rest? What about the rest? That's the issue I have.
Yeah, no, I have the exact same problem. I will tell you from my very specific circumstances, this is what I could get right now. And I'm treating this elective as a proof of concept. And part of it is proof that kids can handle this, because that is an argument out there that kids cannot handle this conversation. And part of it is that my community can handle it, because there are a lot of people in my community who believe that by talking about race, we make the situation worse.
And
So
you would find the same in our congregation.
I have no doubt. My hope is that by proving that we can do this and not blow up the world, we can expand opportunities to continue.
They're great. Okay, thanks for the answer. Good, straight answers.
Greg, this is Steve.
Dave.
I had a follow-up question related to, structural changes that, if you have any advice on how the church may navigate topics that are more considered political, such as reparations. Is that an avenue, or is there a model that you think really gets to that subtle middle ground that could be supported and encouraged from a church perspective, as well as obviously raising the awareness with politicians that can actually move forward on those things?
Sure. Thank you for your question. It's a challenging one. I do a project with my students around reparations, where I challenge them to design the perfect reparations package. And they have to, they work in groups, and they have to present their reparations package, and then we have to vote on which one is the best approach. And it fails every time. Every time they fail to put together something workable, something realistic. And what I've seen in that lesson, and of course part of the lesson is how difficult that is a tendency to forget what reparations is all about. And the key there is that reparations are about expressing regret and attempting a repair for damage done. So in order to design a reparations plan, you can't do it on your own. There's no way you get to decide how to say I'm sorry. So I think the best advice I could give any community, including a church community interested in reparations, is that the people you're seeking to give an apology to ought to be part of the process. And while it's not fair to ask those who've been hurt to solve their own problem, I don't think it is effective to try to solve it for them entirely. It has to be a collaboration. And if you're finding yourself saying, well, how do I reach them? Then you're already making positive steps towards what you want to accomplish. Because if you can establish links that are currently broken, that is reparations. It's not complete, but it's a good first step. And once you've got to a place where you can say, listen, we genuinely want to do good. How? And are helping them get to a point where they are comfortable, safe, and willing to hear that you are serious, and that this is not just crossing something off of the guilt checklist. I would argue you've already gone a hell of a long way down that road.
We have 3 people who have raised their hands. I'm not sure who was first, so I apologize, but I think it was probably Jim, and then David, and then George.
All right, let me unmute myself. Greg, thanks for the history lesson. Some of you might know that my family was there at the beginning of this, right, in Virginia in the 1660s. And from what I understand, having studied this for a while, initially it did start out as a purely economic development that they wanted to maximize profit. And there's no question about that. And yes, it was the easiest way to do it, I think. And over the years, you think about, what it would take to reverse that. And I think people think that they're in a zero-sum game, a game where somebody else's profit is my loss, right? And so I had an ancestor, had a cousin who freed all of his slaves. And yet my ancestor did not, right, at that point. And I think about why. And the only answer I had to that question is that it would have been a grievous loss to his family that he couldn't provide for his sons after that, right? And then when the Civil War came around, the same thing happened. The freed slaves were seen as a huge loss to, the community that enslaved them. So one of the fundamental things that we have to do is understand that somebody else's gain is not necessarily my loss, right? So if somebody is being promoted through diversity, metrics, or somebody is being, to take your example, that they're admitted to a school ahead of, your son or daughter. We have to look at it not as, their gain and my loss, right? We're a very rich country. And how do we go about changing that feeling so that you understand that somebody else's gain is your gain too, and somebody else's loss is your loss?
Yeah, it's a really important question and a really tricky one. And I think the best answer that I can give quickly, I don't want to breeze past you, but this could go for hours trying to figure this one out, is back to the concept that this isn't about hearts and minds. And I think, your example of trying to understand that it's not a zero-sum game it's a mental game, right? We are trying to talk people out of their power. And I think that history has shown us that that is largely a losing proposition. You're actually going to spend far more energy talking to them than actually reaping any benefits from it. I think what we have seen that works is instituting policies that bypass the conversation. Say what you want. Affirmative action works. It has statistically shown to be successful in most of its goals. No program is perfect, but it does succeed largely in increasing both diversity and the profitability of the institutions that institute it. It works. Diversity works for the country. When we get more people and more ideas into our economic system, we all win. It's a hard thing to convince people, but if you force them to live with it, it's the same result. I think that in essence, we need to stop waiting for people to agree with us and start putting in the policies that we know work best. Because let's be clear, that's absolutely what the other side of this equation is doing. The politics of let's maintain the power structure as it is are not waiting for everybody in the country to agree. They are putting in policies that benefit them every opportunity they get. I think the only reasonable way past this is, in essence, to fight fire with fire. When there are opportunities to increase participation and opportunity, we have to jump on them. And I personally believe that if we do that, the benefits will become self-evident rather quickly.
David, you had a question?
Yes, hi.
It's actually Dan with the question.
Okay. I had a 50-50 chance.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you get 2 for 1.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank Greg. I think you gave a really, truly comprehensive historical development in a very concise way. I mean, it's very comprehensive. And I was just thinking of Scott's question. I think it's the not only social responsibility, but it's the ethical responsibility of all the institutions that you've discussed for church, education, government. And I just know that when I was at EDS, we studied with Barbara Harris, who did a wonderful matrix on identifying like where you are privileged, where you stand, how close you stand to the center of power and how distant you are. And I just remember taking a class at Harvard Divinity and, you know, just thinking about this and realizing that there were gentlemen and women who were doctoral candidates, but it struck me that just because I was white, I had really more privilege than the same person who was struggling academically as I was. And that exercise was really great. And when I taught in the University of St. Joseph, I would always use that with my ethics students because they never really see how they are empowered, you know, that it's sort of like a God-given right. And I think like the church, in churches, we have to be reminded of that, and it has to be a part of what they do for us so that we don't become so ineffective and not realize that. And so I just think what you're doing is great work. And David brought it to my attention, and I think it's all great that everyone's here opening themselves up to this, but look at all our faces.
Yeah.
You know, and I would just say, please, if you haven't read Bishop Curry's book,
It's great.
it is wonderful. And do the 10 Commandments of Nonviolence. It's great. So, but Greg, thank you, and Geof, thank you for bringing Greg
Thank you.
to us.
Look forward to more of it.
Yes,
Yes.
and thank you to all who attended.
George, you had a question.
Yes, I would like to suggest that in this kind of analysis of what are problems with racism or discrimination or ability of people to take part in the American economy, that we might think of the word race as not a way of distinguishing among people, but really is the evidence of a giant hoax. In other words, the people who are talking about race, they're saying, well, race is how we distinguish between one person and another, or at least that's what a lot of people have said historically. And it goes back to that fundamental division that Greg said, that, well, how are we going to distinguish between the two classes? We'll say, well, it's a racial one. Well, race is not a valid criteria for distinguishing between people. In the 19th century, it got to the point where Chief Justice Roger Taney of the Supreme Court, in his Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, said, well, let's be frank, there is no rights which the white of blacks, which the whites have an obligation to respect. Those aren't the exact words, but that's the thrust of it. I think we've gotten past that. For example, in the Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, she described very carefully and very effectively the way people were treating each other along racial lines. In other words, just because somebody had or has a single drop of ancestral Black or Indian or whatever blood in them renders them to be an inferior person in the eyes of a significant part of society. And that has been shown over time not to be at all accurate. There are a large number of our fellow Americans who are just as smart as any of us, and they need to be respected. And in dealing with them, we have to ignore this color or other distinguishing features like that, and look at the person as the person who they are and what the capabilities they have. You have to think about this. For example, our President Obama. You say to yourself, well, what is he? Well, a lot of people, first thing they'll say is, well, he's Black. Well, hold on. You have to ask the question, well, why is he? Why are you characterizing that way? He had two parents. If he is characterized as Black because his father was from Kenya, why isn't he characterized as white because his mother was white? And that isn't a shocking thing for many people to consider, that you have in that one person a very accomplished, smart person who can do a lot of things, and as well as or better than anybody else, but he's tagged with this Black label, which is completely irrelevant. In other words, what I would suggest is we think of race as a giant hoax, coming from the 16th century, where they used it as a way of distinguishing between one person and another. But and it comes down to this day. We still recognize the word Black or white or Indian or what have you, and say that this is a way that people characterize or each other, and it's that it's the use of that which is a hoax. It is a false way of distinguishing. That doesn't mean, of course, that if we're trying to combat this discrimination, that we completely ignore what is motivating a person who is discriminating against another person. But the discrimination is based upon maybe a foundational myth of our society that race is a valid way of distinguishing between each other. So we should be thinking about the term race as a giant hoax and not a valid way of distinguishing between one person and another. Now,
George, I think Professor Ibrahim Kendi at Harvard offered a polite way of saying it, that race is really a social construct.
It is a coast.
That is as opposed to, and we as a committee talked about, or as a task group, spent some time with that in our last meeting. If I would like to ask, if you have a question, to please ask it of Greg, because I think there may be others who are.
I think we have to consider race itself as to be a giant hoax. And I'm not saying that we need to recognize it, because we have to recognize it as a hoax that needs to be overcome, but certainly not use it as a way of distinguishing between people.
Thank you.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. I do want to emphasize something that you mentioned, but I think I would be remiss not to bring into this conversation at this point. While obviously you're correct that this is a construct, there's no actual substance behind it, and we have seen incredible harm as a result of this construct. Dismissing it as a hoax out of hand can itself be damaging to our approach. The fact of the matter is that this construct has resulted in extraordinary pain and ongoing systemic inequalities that can only be understood and addressed if we keep that construct within our minds. And we run a real risk of making the mistakes of the 90s and early 2000s of trying to get colorblind, right? Trying to see people without seeing color. And the fact of the matter is that being colorblind is an aspect of privilege, because people of color cannot be colorblind. Their lives are defined by the color that others see them as. And if we choose to see the world without that lens, we are choosing a privilege that is not available to the people that we would like to help. And we are reducing our ability to identify the best way to help them.
I agree.
Thank
I
you.
agree with you. All I'm saying is,
George, I'm going to,
I
I apologize. We're short on time, and I would like to invite another question, if that's all right.
Geof, hi, it's Mary Bowers. I don't know where the hand would be that I would raise on my computer.
Mary,
can I say something?
let me do this. Dawn has had her hand up for a
Okay.
while now, and then
So
we
put
will
me on
come to
your
you,
list.
Mary.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Thanks, George.
Doing my unmute here. My question, I guess it's a statement too, is around the reparations thoughts. I have a very close friend who we met when he's French background. He came to live with us to learn English about 20, 30 years ago. And his background, he's Black or partially Black. His great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of the Portuguese slave traders. And when the slave trade was ending and he was in danger, he married an Ibu woman. They didn't take the Ibus as slaves. They weren't physically equipped for it. And he fled to Brazil and raised generations. There were generations of the family then, mixed race, living in Brazil for a great number of years. The family had incredible guilt over the grandfather, the ancestors. So much so that my friend's grandfather went back to Africa and eventually became president of one of the African countries. And the family still runs a number of NGOs trying to make up for the people that they kidnapped, basically, from those countries. Grandfather, unfortunately, was assassinated by the gentleman whose grandson is now the president. But they are in physical danger in times when they go there. But that guilt has carried through. And that's their way of doing reparations, is to go back right to the roots. So I think, there are different things for different people, but I think we have to think of various ways. Where do we go to help? Not just the ones here, but the ones other places.
Good point. Thank you.
Mary?
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much, Greg and Geof, for putting this all together. I'm on the vestry, and when things have been, when George Floyd happened, and we started to, sit on the corner of Prospect and North Main, we heard a lot of we stood there, and we wanted to not say something. So I being on the vestry, I heard talk about people saying, you got to keep politics out of church, and then and we were kind of, I felt like the word around St. John's was tread lightly because you don't want to offend anyone. And after listening tonight, what I take out of all of this is that, to be better human beings, we need to continue to talk about this and not pretend that it doesn't exist. And, I joined the task force because I feel like I can't be quiet anymore. I just can't stay silent about these race issues. I deal with people every day in my work that are of privilege, and they think that, if you talk about it, then you're just bringing it up and you're creating more of a problem. And I've explained, no, if you don't talk about it, it's a bigger problem. So everything that we're doing, I think we're going in the right direction. And any way we can educate ourselves to be better human beings, I think it's positive. And I think more people need to ask more questions. So yeah, one of my dearest best friends that I had for 19 years in my life was a Black man. And the stories he would tell, I mean, he worked nights and coming home at 2 o'clock in the morning from doing his job, and how many times he got pulled over because of his color. He was he had a white wife, he had, he just, every corner, everything that we take for granted was an issue with him. And so and it happens every day of the week and every night, and it's still going on. And I just feel like, I'm happy that St. John's is moving forward, and we're talking about it. And if you don't know, then you should ask questions. And truly, I would like for us to connect some way with another church, and maybe, after COVID is over, maybe, we could expose members of our church with other members of other churches to see what we could do to, be better human beings, I guess. So thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you for that, Mary. If I may, I'd like to point out what you're identifying there is the power structure. You're absolutely right that speaking out on these issues has risks, and that's because there is power in silence. There is power in maintaining the status quo. So I applaud all of you for sticking your neck out this far already. And we have to keep doing that. We have to keep putting ourselves in a place where we're uncomfortable if we want real change. And we have to remind ourselves that our discomfort is regular for those who do not share in our power.
I don't see any more hands up. I want to thank you, Greg, for the time that you've offered us tonight. I want to thank everybody who has been on this call. When we talk about reconciliation, that is the church's business. That is what our gospel calls us to. And there are resources that the Episcopal Church and the Episcopal Church in Connecticut have prepared and exist on our websites. There are new resources coming out seemingly every day, including an initiative that will be launched on Martin Luther King Sunday called Out of Many One, otherwise known as E Pluribus Unum, what we put on the Great Shield of the United States, which is designed to help us have these conversations with people who hold different perspectives than we have. to find common ground and to move us forward. So I am personally, I'm prejudiced, but I think the church does have a role to play in reducing the inequity of racism in our country, and I'm happy to continue this effort with you, and just thrilled that so many of you took the time this evening to join us on this call. We will be gathering again in a couple of weeks on Tuesday night. That may change. If you're interested, send me an email. We will be talking next about what do we mean by white privilege, and what does that mean in our culture today. So if you would like to join us, please send me an email and we'll be sure to include you in our group. Thank you all. Is there any other question or last questions or thought?
Geof,
Dave?
this is Dan. David.
Ann had her hand up.
Yeah, let's not continue the economic perspective about not talking about this from the pulpit, because if the fears are, it's mentioned, then we're just continuing an economic situation. I think we have to take the risk to speak about it in church.
I second that.
And you had your hand up.
I agree.
You're on mute, Ann.
Yep, I agree. I agree with that. And I just wanted to thank Greg for coming too, and note that at least from my perspective in the various hats or roles that I have, career or otherwise, it's also a mistake to think that educating people will cause change.
Yep.
Right. Educating is certainly an important component, right? But it's a very sort of Aristotelian notion to think that if everybody just gets educated about the problem, then everybody will automatically change and everything will be well. I think that more action is needed on that. So I'm pleased that St. John's is taking it on, and I appreciate, Geof, all the work you're doing on this.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Our goal is to equip the saints to carry on the fight, to put on the armor of right. So, Linda, may I ask you to close us in prayer this evening? You're on mute.
I'd be happy to. Anyone else have a final question, final thought? All right.
Greg,
Huh?
We want to thank you, Greg, very much.
Yes. I echo. Thank you, Greg. It has been great to have you with us, and I'm so glad that people were okay with recording, because there are several folks that couldn't be with us tonight who did want to hear you and hear the conversation. So thanks, and I hope we might even invite you to come back again if you're willing.
Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure to be here, and I'm sure he'll pester me about it.
Okay. You know where to find you. All right. So the Lord be with you.
And also
with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this night. Thank you for bringing Greg into our midst and helping him to open our hearts and minds. Thank you for all those who were able to be with us, and pray for those who could not. Continue to push us and encourage us to see how we have a part in this sin of racism. Help us to know what it is you might be calling us to do as individuals. Help us to have the courage to speak up when we need to, and the wisdom to be silent when we need to. Continue to let us know that you are right there beside us in whatever it is we do. Thank you for the many ways that you open doors for us and open our hearts and minds. And continue to do that for us. Continue to do that for the people of St. John's as we are about these difficult discussions and in discussions that are so important, because we all recognize that we are all children of God, and we give you thanks for helping us to see that this night and always. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
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 Night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you. Have a good night.
Have a restful
Have a good
night.
Thank
night.
you so much.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.